Okay, next we have Dr. Eireann Collins, and we'll be talking today about secure food supply and continuity of business planning. Dr. Eireann Collins is the Emergency Programs and Poultry Programs Coordinator for the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets in the Division of Animal Industry. She's worked for USDA FSIS and in mixed animal practice with a focus on dairy production medicine in Minnesota, Texas, Maryland, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New York. Dr. Collins is a graduate of Iowa State University for the College of Veterinary Medicine. So it's really great to have Dr. Collins join us today, and very fortunate to have you working with us in the New York State Department of Agriculture. So I welcome you this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to discuss the secure food supply and how protecting our livestock industry impacts us in terms of economics, conservation, and of course, a One Health approach to public health. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble getting my slide to advance. All right. As mentioned, I work with Agriculture and Markets in the Division of Animal Industry. And our mission is to protect animals from disease, protect economic loss, and protect public health, including a wholesome food supply. We have about roughly 30 people in our division, primarily made up of field veterinarians and technicians. And as mentioned, I work as an office program manager. So I'm going to give a brief overview of animal agriculture in New York State. So number one, New York is a dairy state. A study out of Cornell a few years ago estimated that New York dairy industry was worth over $16 billion in economic impact to the state. And most people will agree dairy is the single most important economic multiplier in upstate and Western New York. And unfortunately, while our farm and cow numbers continue to decrease, our pounds of milk produced increases each year as our farms improve in efficiency. And I'm going to touch on that again later. Contributing to economic value, most of the milk produced in New York is also processed in New York. Some other New York State ag is beef cattle. So of course, every good dairy cow becomes a beef cow. Swine, and the swine industry in New York is made primarily of pasture or niche markets. And sometimes they will demand a higher price from consumers, but we consider them a high risk production technique. Our poultry industry covers the gamut of conventional to pasture raised, both eggs and meat. And then New York also has one of the largest live bird marketing systems in the country. And again, we consider that a high risk industry due to the commingling of animals at these retail markets. New York has a wonderfully diverse population, and there is a significant demand for both goat and sheep milk, particularly in our urban areas. We do have a captive deer industry, and captive deers are eligible to enter commerce. They are raised for both meat and hunting. Rabbits, again, this focuses more on a niche market, but they are raised in New York for meat, fiber, to go into research, or to enter the companion animal market. And while many of us may not consider cats and dogs as agriculture, we do have breeding kennels and catteries in New York that produce animals for research or to enter the companion animal market, which is a business. Not a food species in this country, horses are considered livestock and are economically important, primarily through our gaming industry. They're highly mobile with a lot of both interstate and international travel, and they can carry or transmit diseases of concern to our food production species, both as a vector or a fomite on the horse or in the equipment. Finally, zoos and aquariums. Again, these are not a food species, but they are susceptible to many of the same diseases as our domestic species. They are important for conservation efforts. They may be high value genetics or specifically high value economic animals. And as we saw last year, the big cats at the Bronx Zoo were the first non-human species definitively diagnosed with COVID. So we need to be aware of their risk for zoonotic potential. So I'm going to give a quick overview of some recent animal disease introduction, the consequences, and then discuss two of our highest consequence foreign animal diseases in the world. So in 2014, 2015, we had an introduction of highly pathogenic avian influenza from wild birds into our commercial flocks. Unfortunately, it did spread through 9 states, resulted in the death of many animals, and also resulted in one of the most expensive foreign animal disease responses in US history, at just under $1 billion. Part of the response that's difficult to quantify is our loss of global market share. When HiPath was diagnosed, many countries placed an embargo on US poultry products. When we returned to negative status, many of our customers had found new suppliers, causing a negative impact on our long-term export markets. A few years later, California broke with exotic Newcastle disease. Now, this is another foreign animal disease of poultry, but the USDA and the state of California were able to keep it out of our commercial industry. And by controlling and containing the disease, it protected our trade status. I'm going to touch on vectors, disease vectors, kind of as part of a One Health approach. With climate change, natural disasters, the number and range of insect vectors is increasing. While mosquitoes are definitely the most important vector in both human health and animal health, ticks are a close second. So the Asian longhorn tick was identified in New Jersey in 2018. A year later, it was identified in 13 states. And based on epidemiology, it's believed to have been here for at least 5 years and with 3 independent introductions. Practically speaking, it would be difficult to impossible to eradicate this tick at this point. And while it's not been shown to spread human or animal disease in the United States yet, it certainly has the potential to do so as it does in other countries. Cattle fever tick is on the Texas border. We've had a control program in place for over 100 years, and this is a definite cost to producers and the taxpayer. These ticks are endemic in Mexico, and weather conditions are allowing this range of tick to expand. New World screwworm is a success story. It was identified in the Florida Keys in 2016. USDA and the Florida Department of Agriculture aggressively contained, controlled, and eradicated this fly. So New World screwworm causes larval mydriasis, which essentially means maggots infest live tissue, and infected, untreated individuals will die usually within 14 days. Thankfully, no humans were infected during this outbreak, but unfortunately, several key deer, which are protective species, were killed. The bont and the tropical bont tick have been identified in the US Virgin Islands, and we have an ongoing response there. So Lone Star tick is a little bit of an oddball, but I wanted to bring it up because it is an endemic tick. However, with climate change, storms, travel, the number of the ticks and the range of this tick is expanding. Of interest to us is its ability to cause alpha-gal syndrome in humans. A host, after being bit by this tick, can experience a number of clinical signs, including a prolonged red meat allergy, which is, of course, of concern to our industry. Everyone here is probably familiar with the deer tick and its role in disease transmission, particularly Lyme's disease. And culicoides are biting flies. They can spread a number of viruses directly or as fomites. And again, the numbers and ranges of these are dramatically impacted by environmental conditions. Rabbit hemorrhagic disease had been considered a foreign animal disease in the US. In 2020, we had an outbreak in the West that unfortunately spilled over into the wild population. And now, rabbits are not considered a primary protein source for humans. They are a major prey species. And effects on the rabbit population will affect predator species, affect the ecosystem, and potentially the interaction between livestock and wildlife. So for ranchers. In addition, there are a number of protected rabbit species with fragile population numbers, and there's a concern how this will affect conservation efforts. Chronic wasting disease is another example of a disease that affects the wild population and the landscape. It is a prion disease affecting deer. It is not shown to be zoonotic, but the CDC cautions people against eating infected animals. There's no vaccine, there's no treatment, and it's 100% fatal to deer. It is currently both in domestic and wild deer in Pennsylvania. So sick deer should immediately report it to the DEC or an environmental conservation officer. So some of the recent diseases that we are trying to manage. Now I'm going to discuss the 2 foreign animal diseases that are the biggest threat to our livestock industries. Foot and mouth disease. So foot and mouth disease is the most highly contagious animal disease in the world. It is not a food safety concern, and it is not a zoonotic concern. There is no relation between hand, foot, and mouth in humans and foot and mouth disease in cattle. However, the disease is highly transmissible between all cloven hoof species. It is reportable to the OIE, which is the equivalent of the World Health Organization of Animals. And the foot and mouth disease status of a country has a dramatic economic impact on trade. And last, but certainly not least, this is an animal welfare disease. Affected animals are sick, affected animals are in pain. FMD, foot and mouth disease, is endemic in around 100 countries. And while North America is considered free, Colombia is considered endemic, and many of our South American partners continue to struggle with the disease. So 20 years ago, foot and mouth was introduced to the UK through garbage feeding of pigs. So millions of animals were killed, billions of dollars were spent to control the outbreak. The producers and responders ended up with severe mental and emotional health impacts from the response industry, the response activities. And the English consumer had a distinctly negative view of the ag industry after this response. One of our takeaways from this is that the UK continued to find positive animals for 7 months after the index case. So even on a small island nation with water barriers, roughly the size of Alabama, they were unable to contain or control the disease. A foot and mouth disease outbreak in the continental United States would have an estimated cost of $128 billion per year, with a minimum of 5 years to regain trade status. African swine fever is a swine-specific disease. It is also not a food safety disease, and it also does not affect human health. However, it is highly contagious with almost 100% morbidity and almost 100% mortality in swine. There is currently no vaccine available. And as you can see from this picture, this disease also has significant animal welfare impacts. In 2018, a global African swine fever outbreak started, moving from Russia into China and spreading throughout Asia. It is estimated that the virus caused the death of 25% of the world's pig population. So again, 25% of the world's pig population. Aside from the obvious local nutrition security issues this causes, I'd like you to look at the picture to the left. A high consequence animal disease of this magnitude has global impact. As you can see from the snow in the background, it's winter, and they are disposing of these carcasses through incineration by burning tires. The environmental impacts of this will be felt globally. And we can only guess at the mental and emotional stress this puts on the responders, the producers, and how it's going to affect their friends and family around them. Finally, in terms of food chain logistics and supply, the loss of 25% of the swine population will cause a decrease in the demand for foodstuffs in these affected regions. And that has an impact on the global crop market and also increases the risk of disease spread through contaminated feed. So I'm going to take a little break. I've toured you through some very disturbing pictures. I just wanted to share this picture of happy dairy cows grazing in upstate New York. And I want to take a moment to appreciate that we don't have these diseases, and also that foot and mouth has not been diagnosed in the United States since 1929. So why should we invest time and resources into the Secure Food Supply Program? I hope I've been able to impact on you that the consequences of these foreign animal diseases can be devastating to producers, responders, to consumers, and to the economy and to the environment. And New York is a high-risk state. We're an international hub, which is wonderful. The picture here is a member of the Beagle Brigade at JFK Airport in New York City. And we gain amazing diversity through this, but it is a risk factor. In addition, we are a nuclear state. Some of the people here may be involved with our nuclear preparedness efforts. And if there was an incident, one of the results would be a food embargo. This time of year always reminds us that New York is a target for terrorism, both internationally and domestic. And finally, the last 18 months have shown the impact of natural and man-made disasters on the logistics of the food supply. Most notably, the effects of COVID on slaughter capacity and the cyber attacks on JBS earlier this year. And the risk of introduction is real and continuous. So this news article praises our Beagle Brigade for identifying 50 shipping containers. So 50 shipping containers, 1 million pounds of illegal meat that they attempted to smuggle through the New Jersey port of Newark. So in response to a high consequence disease such as foot and mouth disease or African swine fever, current US guidance calls for a national 72-hour stop movement order of animals and products. It is in the best interest of producers to have a contingency plan in place. This slide from the foot and mouth disease guidance document is a good rubric for any disease outbreak. So small focal outbreaks, such as the New World screwworm that I mentioned in the Florida Keys, can be quickly contained and stamped out. Larger scale outbreaks, such as the Asian longhorn tick, where we've had a much longer time between introduction and identification, where it involves a larger geographic area, affects more animals, and has spread into the wild population, will take years, if ever, before we're able to eradicate it. The initial disease response will be based on zones of infection, based off diagnosis, infected premises, neighboring premises, or contact premises, very similar to the three-stool approach David mentioned for human epidemiology. Movement in these zones will be restricted and require permits. Meeting permit requirements will fall to the producers. Approving and monitoring these permits will under the authority of states and the USDA. So I believe it was Mike Tyson who said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that is probably very true. But the planning process, allowing producers to think out contingency plans, consult with subject matter experts, and identify best practices before an incident so they can have knowledge and flexibility if or when they're faced with a disaster. So now I'm about 60% through the presentation, and I hope I've convinced you of the need for a plan. And now I'm finally going to get around to discussing what is secure food supply. So secure food supply is a voluntary farm-centric program designed to protect the livestock industry through biosecurity and allow for continuity of business in an outbreak by putting steps in place that will control the risk of animal and product movement. Again, we're never going to have no risk, but we can control the risk of potential disease transmission. It is based on the idea that the producer is responsible for keeping their animals safe and that routine biosecurity is not sufficient for a novel, highly contagious disease. And I'm sure everyone in this meeting can think of at least one example of a novel, highly contagious disease. So again, the goal of secure food supply is keep farms in business, keep adjunct farm services in business. Again, as I mentioned, the multiplier effect of the dairy industry in upstate New York, keep processors in business. detect, control, and contain disease, and of course, protect our public health and assure a continuous supply of wholesome meat and animal products for our consumers. The plan is based on 3 tenets: an accountability leader, a farm-specific plan, and a line of separation. So the biosecurity manager is our accountability partner. They are responsible for developing and implementing the plan. This can be an owner or an employee. An operation-specific plan, because if you've been to one farm, you have been to one farm. The plan should be based on the scope of the operation as illustrated by a labeled map and should be kept up to date with changes. So the labeled premise map should give a good visual overview of how things move on a farm, identify higher risk areas, and where mitigation efforts will be set up. And all of this is going to be based on the idea of a line of separation, which is a moat to minimize the risk of disease entering a premise or disease leaving a premise by utilizing controlled access points. And while this sounds great, we need to acknowledge that farms are busy and complex organizations. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the dairy industry produces more milk with less cows due to improved efficiencies. And part of that efficiency is specialization. We have calf feeders, we have heifer raisers, we have any number of specialized industries such as custom cut feed, manure, contracted manure management that works with the dairies. And no longer does a milk truck come every 3 days. Farms more commonly direct ship milk, and milk pickup can be as often as 2 to 3 times per day. So secure food supply planning is important, but it often doesn't feel urgent. If we look at our own lives and take non-farm emergency planning, how many of us have a valid will on file, have an up-to-date power of attorney, an up-to-date healthcare proxy, end-of-life directions? Most of us would agree these things are important, but they don't feel like we're hopefully not going to need them anytime soon. And I will say, to be less dramatic, how many of us have said, I'll get gas in the morning, and then regretted it by the next morning? So the 2018 Farm Bill created what's called the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Plan. This program is a series of competitive grants to encourage disaster preparedness and response. In 2020, our division submitted a proposal focused on outreach and education. The goal of the grant is to provide resources to farms in designing the secure milk supply, or a secure food supply. We incorporated the secure food supply module into our New York State Cattle Health Assurance Plan. NISCHAP is an integrated disease prevention plan that's been available to New York State producers for decades. So the secure food supply modules will be available for all commodity groups, not just cattle, but we started with secure beef, which is currently up on our NISCHAP website. Our next module will be secure pork supply, and I'm going to touch on this again later. While we are focusing on animal disease, COVID and the cyber attacks on JBS have shown that while the just-in-time nature of animal agriculture and the consolidation of our food supply chain is highly efficient, the lack of redundancy in the system also makes it fragile and vulnerable when there is unanticipated disruptions. The Pork Checkoff created a farm crisis operation planning tool that is publicly available to producers. And while it is swine focused, it can be easily extrapolated to other commodity groups as a framework. And as the people in this meeting are committed to protecting our food supply from farm to fork, I wanted to discuss African swine fever in the spirit of One Health. As I mentioned, in 2018 to 2019, African swine fever killed 25% of the pigs in the world. And unfortunately, it has not been controlled nor contained. In July of this year, a Russian strain of the virus was identified in the Dominican Republic. And to refresh everyone's knowledge of the Caribbean geography, the Dominican Republic shares the island of Hispaniola with Haiti. Haiti was diagnosed with a confirmed case of African swine fever this Tuesday. The Dominican Republic is also 236 miles from Puerto Rico. And in fact, there's a daily ferry between the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a US territory. And based on OIE standards, if Puerto Rico becomes infected with African swine fever, the United States would be classified as infected with African swine fever. The USDA is working with the OIE to designate Puerto Rico as a surveillance zone to protect our trade status of the continental United States. Fortunately, due to the many recent disasters that Puerto Rico has survived, such as Hurricane Maria, there is a large population of feral swine on the island, which is a large risk factor for the spread of African swine fever. Puerto Rico also allows garbage feeding. Garbage feeding is defined as feeding food waste that contains meat or may have had contact with meat products. In the United States, garbage feeders must be licensed and food waste must be cooked at time and temperature. It is also illegal to feed food waste from international flights or from ships. Garbage feeding is prohibited in New York. However, there is an exception for individual household waste, meaning you can feed your table scraps to your backyard pigs. So in New York, pigs may be fed produce or bakery products, as long as there's no cross-contamination by meat. If you work with a food production facility and find that they are giving food scraps to a farm, please contact myself or our division. They're not going to get in trouble. Our focus is on outreach and education. But as I mentioned, garbage feeding introduced foot and mouth disease to the UK in 2001, and it is believed that garbage feeding ship waste introduced African swine fever to the Dominican Republic. There's no malicious intent, but a series of high-risk activities led to very consequential outcomes. Outreach and education will be directed towards both the food production facilities and any farms they may work with. So with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions or if anybody has any comments they would like to share, I'm definitely open for that. And this is my contact information. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was an amazing presentation, a terrific amount of information, and a very well delivered presentation, I will add. So thank you so much for that. I have a question, is that, so I have been in bakeries where they actually, not only do they give the scraps of the bakery products, but they use the scrapings from the floor. So whatever grease and flour and dough residue that's in that baking area, they literally would scrape it up, put it in buckets, and then they used to tell, I mean, this is a long time ago, so I don't know if it still happens, but would that be an acceptable practice to use the scrapings of from the floor?
As long as they're not making like meat pies or any risk that there could be cross-contamination with meat,
okay.
They certainly could do that. It would be legal. And sometimes we have, heifer raisers that will take produce or bread, to feed the cows, but it's the same thing. As long as there's no meat, it is legal. But we do inspect facilities that we know are doing this. We call them swine feeder inspections. And again, it's mostly an opportunity to do outreach and education. We don't believe anybody would really want to risk the entire industry or the trade status of the country. We feel that if people are doing a higher risk activity like that, it's more because they don't realize how prevalent African swine fever is, how prevalent foot and mouth disease, because again, it's not really part of our day-to-day rubric. So right. We just want contact with people so that we can really focus on outreach and education.
Right. That's good to know those. It's something that, so I'm in the food division. So it's certainly something that we can share with our folks, our clients that we inspect, and just to make sure that there is some kind of outreach, and we'll share the information with you. And I'm sure, yeah, and I'm sure any of the industry people that are on here as well can certainly take your information and share that, and to the others that they are dealing with also. It is, it's frightening. I have worked with the USDA, the SITC people, smuggling, interdiction, trade, and compliance through USDA, APHIS, and I have been enlightened myself. But it's very frightening to hear what you're saying about the African swine flu and Puerto Rico. It's really scary. So I don't know how we can control that level of really and truly not getting any of this here. It's a frightening situation.
Again, one of our high risks is that our state has the highest human traffic between the Dominican and Republic and New York State. Again, primarily in the city, in New York City. So we have wonderful border protection. As you can see, the Beagle Brigade is out there. And the ports of entry are concerned, but more of concern is really people, kind of what happened in the UK 20 years ago is somebody illegally brought in a pork product from another country, probably shared it at the table with their family, and then the waste products got fed to their pigs. Mm-hmm. And again, there is nothing, malicious about it. I bet the illegal importation wasn't even a malicious intent. They, just wanted to have their sausage or whatever it was. Yes. But the consequences were, extreme. So having an opportunity just to bring that information to people would be great. And I appreciate if anybody knows anyone that they want to share with us. And again, it's not illegal for restaurants or whatnot to share if they have produce that has no meat contamination. And I know there's a big effort to be more aware of how we use our resources and how we use our nutrition and avoid landfilling things that could be put to additional use. But we should do that strategically.
Right. That's great. Just trying to read. Yeah, so Sarah is from the food division is also agreeing that this is great information that we will share with our field staff for sure, so they can be enlightened to that, and we would have a good open dialogue with you.
So I have a question here that said BSE, bovine BSE was in Canada years ago. Is that not a concern anymore? And it is. So we did end up with a BSE positive cow at a slaughter plant in California, again, about 20 years ago. And truthfully, that occurrence was probably the greatest opportunity for improving our animal welfare at slaughter in our history. Even though BSE certainly does not have the death loss in humans that like Salmonella or Campylobacter would, it is a terrible disease. So BSE is a prion disease like chronic wasting disease, but it affects humans. And what they did is they revamped our entire slaughter process. So downer cows can no longer go into our food supply. Meaning if you have a cow down, whether she broke her leg or because she was sick, that animal is no longer harvested for human consumption. In addition, the strategies they would use to remove meat from either the spinal cord or from the head were changed. So they could no longer use high pressure devices to get meat off the caveats of the bone. We don't generally take brain or spinal material, can't go into those special mixed products they used to make where it would just kind of get ground with everything else. And even the way we slaughter animals or do the kill shot or the stun shot is different, where they no longer can use pneumatic devices that would have a risk of putting CNS tissue into tissue that would be going for consumption. So there was a lot of changes that were made in response to BSE. And again, I think there was only 50 to 60 human deaths reported worldwide from it, but we made a lot of changes, a lot of very good, wonderful changes in response to it. So we do currently have a surveillance. So any down cows that are slaughterhouse get checked for BSE. We also do on-farm testing. So we do a lot of testing, if only to meet our international export requirements for meat. Because Japan, especially, we send a lot of high quality cuts of cattle to Japan, and they have a stringent requirement in terms of BSE surveillance.
John Luker's asking, is there still a chronic waste disease in deer in central New York? The concern. There was a suspected case around 15 to 20 years ago when it was identified.
Yes, so it is correct. It was, I think, around 2005. It was found in central New York, and the area it was found had a number of issues going on. They had a person who was raising captive deer. He was also rehabilitating fawns without a proper license. And he was also doing taxidermy. So he was taking deer from Pennsylvania or wherever from multiple different places and doing taxidermy on them. And there was a way for those fawns and his captive deer to get near the waste from the taxidermy efforts. So at that time, both our department in DC did a lot of work to depopulate deer in that area. And we do have a very active surveillance program. It has not been identified in New York since then. However, with prion diseases, as we saw with BSE or Kuru or Creutzfeldt-Jacobs, it can take a decade or more to actually have symptoms show up. In addition to that, the way prions work is they can contaminate the landscape, meaning that you could have an infected deer that urinates or defecates or dies on the landscape. And it is believed that grass or plants in that area could take up the prion as they're growing and be eaten by another deer. So again, once you have contamination of the landscape, it's very concerning that we'd ever be able to clean it up. Hasn't been identified in New York. However, last year in the Susquehanna Valley, which is kind of a direct shot into New York from Pennsylvania, it was identified in wild deer. In addition, Pennsylvania has over 2,000 captive deer farms, and they have a number of farms, about 200, that are under quarantine for having active CWD infection. And while the importation of CWD species is banned in New York State, wild deer do not always listen to our restrictions.
You did mention something early on in the presentation about captive deer, and I really didn't know what that meant. So is that what you're saying, that they're quarantined?
Yeah, so we have about 200 captive deer in New York. So for slaughter purposes, captive deer can enter into commerce through use of 5A slaughter because they are non-amenable species, but you can utilize New York State's licensing so that they can enter into commerce. Some of these deer do go into restaurants or the food chain in that direction, but most of them are raised for these trophy hunting efforts. So they do pose a risk. They are regulated by both our division and the DEC. We have fencing requirements. We have movement restrictions on them. But again, we call them captive cervids, not domestic cervids, for a reason. These are not like dairy cows where you're handling them. They are still, wild animals essentially at heart. And if you were to have a white-tailed deer, break through your fencing and go into the woods, it's a white-tailed deer. It's going to be able to intermingle with the wild species, opposed to if you had a cow get out, you could probably tell the difference between your beef cow and the white-tailed deer. Aside from chronic wasting disease, Deer can also carry tuberculosis, which again, we have a controlled program for food safety in this country, and brucellosis, which again is another controlled program disease.
So you know how like you can buy just about anything online. I'm sitting when you were talking about the swine fever and foot and mouth. I'm thinking to myself, can someone purchase these viral situation? I can't think of the wording right now. I'm sorry. Can someone purchase these and then just go out and infect our farms? Like, is it possible? Are they for sale online?
So I don't know if you could get the virus per se. I'm not going to say you
Yeah.
can't get anything on Amazon, but our biggest threat really would be so they're both very hardy, especially African swine fever, where they could contaminate a meat product. Even some cured meats will not, the curing process will not destroy the virus.
Mhm.
So our biggest risk would be, again, this garbage feeding.
Yeah.
Intentionally or unintentionally, if somebody were to give, it's almost, this is the right group because it's almost a foodborne illness with pigs and cattle, where if you were to feed them contaminated feed or contaminated meat, that would be our primary concern for introduction of the virus.
Gotcha.
We have so many stringent measures in place that we would hope that it would not be caused by direct to animal transmission.
Mhm. And we just have a question here. Does our division, does your division, the department, provide any kind of materials, or is there anything for the hunters to have so we can explain to them about the different diseases?
So for chronic wasting disease, the DEC does do a very robust effort with its hunters, especially on the southern tier. You are not allowed to bring a full hunted deer that you caught in Pennsylvania back into New York. There's a lot of restrictions on what type of products you can bring in. Again, these are wild caught. And they do a lot of surveillance. They do slightly different surveillance in the wild deer than we do in the captive deer, just because of reporting requirements. But they do a lot of outreach. And as for our department, for hunters, we don't really do too much direct outreach to the hunting population, but we're not against it. We certainly would. We try and rely a lot on our Cornell Cooperative Extension partners to help with doing producer outreach. We take our fair meetings as a good opportunity to advise producers or backyard enthusiasts about different disease risks. Again, avian influenza, always in the back of our minds, there's the idea that it is a zoonotic potential. It can come in through wild birds. And of course, as the high path from 2014, 2015 shows, it can also be economically devastating.
Yeah, well, listen, I really appreciate your time today. It was an eye-opener, very enlightening information. And Betsy has written several times that it's disturbing, and I agreed with her. So I'm sure the others on the call here are agreeing and thanking you for your time and your work that you do, because obviously it's a serious situation that you're helping us to control. So I thank you for not only your presentation, but for what you do as well. So thank you very much.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So Dr. Collins had her present information up there. And if anyone needs, we can share. If you don't have it, we can share with you. Just send me an email and I'll get you her email address if you have any kind of questions or follow up, and we can help you out there.